morning, good afternoon, or good evening to you. Welcome to my session inside the Ionic conference. I'm happy to talk about the Angular routing today because it still makes a lot of problems for a lot of developers. So we will try to demystify a few things about the Angular router, look at different features and functionalities. So hopefully you can build even better apps after this talk. If you don't know me, my name is Simon. I'm kinda into Ionic since about, let's say, 5 years. I regularly blog about it on DevTactic. I run the Ionic Academy, which is like Team Treehouse only focused on Ionic. I build products around Ionic. The latest is Kickoff Ionic to bootstrap Ionic apps and do a lot on YouTube. And well, I'm self-employed and just do everything around Ionic. So I hope I can give you some information about the Angular routing concept in Ionic. Especially, we will today focus on the general router logic, how the router works, how it finds the routes in your application, what features or especially the router offers, how to pass data inside your application to different pages. There are different concepts to do this. Some are better, some are maybe not so good. And finally, we will also take a look at the Ioniconf component, which I think is kind of underrated, but really helpful and a bit tricky to set up. So we will do all of this with a few slides and also a code example that I've prepared, but I will tell you more about this in a second. First of all, let's start with a quote from a great man, which happens to be our very special Mike. Mike said this to me when I proposed the topic of this talk to him, and I think it's kind of close to the reality because the routing inside our Ionic application isn't actually too hard, and we as developers tend to make it way too confusing and overcomplicate the things, and that's just unnecessary, and you will see why. Because if we start at the basics, our application, our Ionic application starts within our app component with just 3 lines of code. The 3 lines are an Ion app tag around an Ion router outlet. This is really just the first place that you have to understand. In Angular applications, you would only see a router outlet. It's mostly the same. Ionic simply adds some animations, some styling classes for iOS and Android around this, and also a few other minor details, I would say. So Angular will then present all of your applications, everything that you've defined in this one Ion router outlet. And you do this by defining all the routes in some routing files. This doesn't have to be one file, although your application starts with one. This could be tons of different files. It's just important that you still have the overview about everything. To give you a better picture of this, so if you compare this setup with this is kind of more structured. And I think this is really what Ionic or Angular developers should see if they look at their routing setup. Your routing setup is simply a tree of router states. It begins with the route state or the root state. I always get confused with that word. And everything else that you define simply follows this pattern. It doesn't have to matter if it's like here, home, and inside next to each other, or if you go down into child routes and have a menu, you perhaps have a parameter like ID, or in menu you get more routes. Everything is really just a tree. And once you understand this concept, I think it actually becomes a lot easier to build your application, because you can really sketch this out on paper, get out a paper for one of your applications and try to draw a tree like this for your application. I'm sorry about this, I'm really bad at drawing things. And once you get this tree and you navigate around your app and you experience problems, it becomes quite easy to see why. So if you have an URL like whatever root inside profile and you get an error, can't match any routes, you simply see that the router won't be able to find anything because you have to go along this tree and find the right route for your URL. In this case, for example, only root inside menu would work. Root inside profile wouldn't work. It's that easy. It's really that easy. And we will take a look at exactly this in a real application that I've prepared for this talk. It looks like this. So we got a starting page. We can go into a menu page, navigate around in our menu. We can go to a details page, and we can do this in a lot of different ways, which we'll take a look at. And we can also open a modal in which we can go a few levels deeper, back or to root, and close it. So that's really the idea in here. You can also follow along this. I will quickly remove myself. So scan the QR code, make a screenshot, or I've also sent Mike the files upfront, the links to both the GitHub repository of the code and also for the hosted application. So if you want to check it out, follow along. So first thing, the router basics. You've already seen this perhaps, and you know this. It might be nothing new for you. You assign components, or which are most likely called pages in your Ionic application, to different router states, which are basically URLs. You usually use lazy loading for those files. If you use standard Angular, you usually have components, but you can still use lazy loading if you want to. But in general, with Ionic, you are lazy loading those files, and we will take a look at why and how this works in a second. If you think about your tree, if you think about the router states or URLs, you always should keep in mind that the Angular router really looks for the first match in that tree. If you have a routing file in which you have multiple routes with the same URL, the Angular router will always take the first match and display this page within your router outlet. This is really an important concept. I know most of you are not having duplicate URLs, but still sometimes you have an empty route and you don't understand why the router is picking a certain page or not going into a certain page, and that might be the reason, because the router is simply looking inside your tree for the way to the component that should be displayed. So this will be our next topic, but for now, let's quickly dive into our conference app. Here I got the same application that you might see as well. And as I said, everything starts in our app routing module. Load children indicates that we're using lazy loading since I think Angular 8 or 9, we got also this nice new syntax which helps us to even get code completion in here. So previously we just had string to the routing file, and now as you can see we got even code completion in here. So for example, for our home road, we load the children, which is our homepage module. Within that home module, there's not a lot of information, but we are importing the homepage routing module. Basically, every page inside your Ionic application has its own routing module file since I think Ionic 5. And within this routing file, we see what is usually on the top level within Angular components, within Angular routing, where we actually got the real component. So this is just an empty path because the router takes, for example, the URL /inside or /home. And once the router has resolved the first path of a URL, that path is basically gone. So if you would, let's say you have a URL like home whatever, if it will look like this, you can imagine the router goes into this. Oh, okay, cool, I can resolve the first path. Let's get rid of it. And then we arrive in our home module, or better, the home routing module, and we look for /whatever. Of course, we haven't defined it, so it won't work. But usually you arrive at this point anyway with just blank and no path. So the homepage would be resolved. So that's lazy loading in your application. It helps to reduce the size or the initial load of your application. Not all components or pages have to be loaded initially, and it's just really a faster way, and I think that it's out of the box supported with Ionic and integrated is really great for all of us. Now, In our application, we see we can navigate to the empty path, which would redirect to home, another feature. Here is our path redirect to home. This is also the standard in Ionic applications. Now, if we want to go to another page, we click Go Inside. We see that it changes actually to inside list already here at the top, which is kind of strange because within our homepage, we have a router link that only says inside. Why is this working? Shouldn't we be on simply inside? No, we are not, because we can follow easily now with our knowledge about the tree and how the router resolves the URL, the path. So this will first of all go into this children of inside. And now, once again, we can go into the dedicated routing file. And within that routing file, we see that we have a parent component with children. So because from the homepage, we only arrive in this file and the inside component of the path is already resolved, we basically have no information in this children array which one to pick. But gladly, we have a nice redirect in here, which redirects to list, and boom, we arrive on inside/list. That's exactly what you see happening right here. So that is some general information about the routing, and now we need to take this a step further with some more data in our pages, because just routing around is quite boring. What you really want to do is you want to pass data information from a list page to a details page or to a modal or to anything else. And there are actually 3 ways to do this. First one is my favorite and what you usually should do, I think. It's having params in the URL. You can resolve that ID inside a page with a service. You can make an HTTP request, anything like this. Second option, query params can work. Not really my favorite, especially if you want to pass more information. And the third option is, well, it is an option, but there are downsides to this. And I want to show you for all 3 cases a quick example. So let's take a look once again at our application. I got a little input here, so I can input a Pokemon number. I don't know which one. Yeah, let's just pick 42. And I can go to details. I don't have any information in my path because that is the empty route. I specified in my routing setup list details, so it displays the page, and we can't really pass information in that case. We can, however, pass information if we add a component like this ID. And this means we can now add a little ID like 42 to this URL, and then the page would resolve some information. Resolve, keep this in mind, we will take a look at this as well. Don't really mind this, we will get into this in a second. But really the important part is the 3 different options we had to pass data to a page. First option, which I clicked in the beginning, just uses router link details, not really passing any data. We can also use the router link with brackets, which helps to construct the path like /details/myID, and now getting the value of our own input field. So this will go to details with an ID. I've also added 2 more functions to open the details with query params or with navigation extras. If we take a look at my code implementation, we see the 2 examples. This is an example of passing query params to the route using the router service. So using the router from code or from TypeScript or from HTML, both work completely fine. But the problem is, you see, what we do, we stringify an object, and this is just a small object, and pass it to the page. And the result is that your URL becomes this. And while it's working, I can extract the data from it. It's not really cool, although you don't see it in a mobile application. If you deploy your Ionic app as a website, this is just really ugly. Better if you go to details with an ID, you got a clean URL list details 42, and the page is able to simply resolve or get that ID and then make an HTTP request or get the data from a service. The final or the third option was the Angular navigation extras. This is quite nice because from code it is pretty clean. You can simply pass to a state any date you want and it is stored in the state. You pass it along to your URL and what happens is the URL stays the same and you got the information in here. The only problem is now when I refresh my application, my information of the state is gone. And this wouldn't happen with query params, although I don't really like that option, or with this option, because now I can actually refresh the page and I would get the information once again. So I would always recommend to go the first route, have IDs in your path, don't really pass full objects to a page. It really destroys the state of your application and you can't really refresh anymore. Really make it clean, use the ID in your URL. Now, about a few other features of the router. First of all, you can protect pages, especially information important if you're using authentication like a JSON Web Token. But it also works for anything else. The user shouldn't enter a page because the wrong role, because the form wasn't finished, anything like this. And you can prevent this with a guard. What's also great is you can use a resolver inside your routing, which helps to resolve all the necessary data before the actual page is shown. We will take a look at the code for this. There are a few downsides to this, and I think sometimes a skeleton view might improve the perceived performance of your application, because using a resolver means you stay on one page. In the background, it maybe makes an HTTP request and loads, and once the data is there, the next page is pushed in. The good thing is the next page can completely be displayed immediately. But the downside is that it looks like your app is first of all a bit hanging on that page and then makes the navigation, but we will take a look at it as well. What is also great, especially if you deploy to the web, are fallback URLs and using the router link active directive, which is a great helper for us in our application. So back to our code. I somewhere added the router for this. If I could find my code implementation, there we go. Actually, it's just a dummy guard which gets from the route the ID, and if the ID is equal to 100, we will not allow access to a page. You can now use this guard inside your routing setup, and I think my routes are right here. So we have used it, or I've used it for can activate, which means can activate, the guard will be called before the page is activated. It will check the URL, we got access to all the params. You could also do anything else in that route and check if the user is allowed. So let's try and set 100, go to details with ID. Guard prevent this, guard says no. No chance to enter the page. Also wouldn't work, like this. Wouldn't work if I put in 100 into the URL, should result in an error as well, but now I think I'm actually lost and I haven't implemented to go back then. But that's the power of a guard, really helpful to protect certain elements of your application. Also, our resolver can, for a specific route, resolve the information. You put it into a dedicated block and say the value Pokemon will be available and the details resolver will take care of it. Now, this implementation isn't super easy because I wanted to have a bit more realistic flair. For example, making an HTTP request and displaying a loading controller while doing it. Because the loading controller returns a promise, we need some RxJS logic to return it to an observable. Doesn't really have to be your problem here. It's just to keep everything in order. The important part is that we make an HTTP request to the Poke API, just a little example I did, and then we wrap it up by hiding the loading. And then on our details page, we're able to simply access the data from the route snapshot. This is really great. a great feature of the resolver, and it means directly in the beginning the full data is available. If you see the other implementations, you see this one right here is, for example, to get the ID from the URL. We would have to subscribe to the param maps and get the ID. This means the page is initially constructed and might be empty. So this could really be a problem. You might need the Elvis operator and so on. From the query params, once again, it's kind of tricky to parse back the data. And getting the routes state works as well, but nothing comes really to the ease of using the resolver. What we also saw, or what I also wanted to show you, was a redirect. And that is simply inside our app routing, for example, by using a wildcard ***, which means every page that doesn't exist, for example, this page won't exist, will bring us directly to the error page. However you want to do this. You can do a 404 page, some information, whatever. In a mobile application, this usually doesn't happen, but once you go web, progressive web app, this becomes more and more important. So fallback, cool feature of the router as well. And also using the active class of the router. You can see, I think this, let's make this a bit smaller. This little blue badge at the left side. This is not automatically there, but it's in our menu, and it's using the router link active directive and then saying, if this router link is active, please use my class, which is just a border left. So another really great feature of the router. Now, because the time is almost over, let's quickly go back to our slides and check out one final example. All of this happens with the URL and everything is cool, but what happens if you have a modal or a popover which are not part of your Angular routing? These live completely above your application. And the solution to this is using the custom Ionconf and Ionconf link. In other words, or in Ionic documentation words, this is a standalone component for loading arbitrary components and pushing new components onto the stack. Exactly what you need if you want to navigate in modals, if you want to have like a menu with a side menu or any nested list kind of thing. From our application, it looks like this. We can open a modal, we can go deeper, and you see the level increases, and we can go back, we can go to root, we can close it. All of this works by not using the deck-deck-go slides, but by using the Ionic code within our home, without our list page. So this is the place where we start the modal. What I do is I created a modal base page for this, which acts like a template, I would say. So my modal base page consists only of the Ionconf element and a root page that will be set as the root of this Ionconf. And that's exactly what we pass right here, which is now the real page that should be displayed. So within the root Ionconf, we say, please display my modal page. And my modal page now is a kind of cool implementation, which uses the Ionconf link to go deeper into the stack. In this page, my next page, which should be displayed as a component, is simply once again my modal page. So that's why we got this like infinite stacking. And we say, please go forward, use this component, and also pass these properties to the next one, which are increasing my level. And by going root, we just use the router direction root and component next page. And boom, we got our full own custom navigation inside a modal. I also got a complete tutorial on this. This, of course, was just a quick walkthrough, but I hope this gave you an idea of how you could implement your own navigation in places that are not within the Angular routing. So, yeah, it's not tied to the app's URL. If you want to get the code for everything that you've seen, check out this. I will also once again hide me. You can see the GitHub URL, and Mike should have the URL as well and supply it afterwards. Hope you now made a screenshot. And let's make a quick recap before my time runs out. Your routes inside an Ionic Angular application with the Angular router are just a tree. If you have any problems, enable the tracing, which is like just setting a little option on the router, or draw it on paper. I mean it. Draw it on paper, draw a tree, and understand the routes in your application. If you want to, or I actually recommend it, to split your routes into child routing files, because having just one giant routing file isn't really good. So split it. It makes guards or using guards easier to protect a whole inside area. Use the right approach to pass data in your application. Remember, ID or passing the value within the URL is good. Query params, if you just have a few, it's okay. Using the navigation extras makes it harder to test your application because the state is lost once you refresh the application. And in general, I would recommend the first option. And of course, use guards and resolver when appropriate to make your life easier in your application. And of course, I would recommend to check out the Ioniconf component if you haven't used it. I really like it. It is a great component for special cases. So don't overcomplicate things. That's the message of demystifying Angular routing. I hope you enjoyed this talk. Thank you, Ioniconf. I would love to see you as a new member inside my Ionic Academy. Check it out, give it a try. And of course, I think we will have a little Q&A session. So I will for now hand it over to Mike, and I'm here for your questions.